All right. Hi, everybody. We're back, and we're back for our next panel, which is on aligning approaches to the international law of the sea in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll briefly introduce my guests. Are they all here? Can you make the gallery view a bit more extensive, Phoebe, so I can see? Oh, yep. Okay, great. So our first speaker on this panel, and I don't know where my notes are, but it's Beck Strating, who is the executive director for La Trobe Asia in Melbourne. She's a prolific writer. She's also the winner of the Boyer Prize, which I believe it was 2018 for her article on Timor-Leste, and that was the Boyer Prize is the best article for that year in the Australian Journal of International Affairs, which is the best journal on international affairs in Australia, and it's also published by us. Following Lynn, we will have, following Beck, we will have Lynn Kwok, and Lynn is the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Got it right this time. She's one of two senior fellows who organizes the Shangri-La Dialogue, although this year, unfortunately, the Shangri-La Dialogue had to be cancelled at the last minute. Never mind. She's also the co-editor with Tim Huxley this year of the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment. Welcome, Lynn. Who's next? We have Rachel Esplin-Odell. Rachel is a research fellow in it's the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. She is also the co-author of the Quincy Institute's assessment on East Asia. You're going to have to forgive me, I don't have the title in front of me. I think it's Towards an Inclusive and Balanced East Asia or something like that. She's new to our activities at the Institute. Lynn and Beck have been here before, so I want to wish her a hearty welcome on board. And finally, we have Hatakeyama Kyoko, who is a professor at the University of Niigata Prefecture. And she is also the author of a recent book on Japanese security called, I believe, Japan's Evolving Security Policy. So four great speakers here to talk about how we align, or if we can align, our thoughts on the international law of the sea in the Indo-Pacific, because as I'm sure you're about to hear, there are a lot of people who do not believe necessarily that like-minded actors share, although we call them like-minded actors, share similar ways of looking at particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So I shall throw things over to Beck to get us started.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Bryce, and thank you to the AIIA National Branch for putting on this fabulous dialogue. I'm delighted to be on a panel with Lynn, Rachel and Kyoko Sensei. It's a real delight to be here talking about this issue. And Bryce, you've assembled a panel with exceptional expertise. The other three, I mean, not so much me, but the other three. I've been asked to talk about Australia and the law of the sea. So Australia is a vast continent surrounded by three littoral oceans, the Southern, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and over 99% of Australia's imports and exports by volume are traded by the sea. Australia also has considerable maritime interests generated under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Australia's exclusive economic zone is the world's third largest, and its search and rescue area constitutes around 53 million square kilometres, or around 1/10 of the Earth's surface. So despite this, Australia has not always identified strongly as a maritime nation, but I suspect that this is starting to change. And the central preoccupation for Australia that extends to the maritime domain is how does a small population with 25 million people protect its maritime area and protect its resources, but also enact a maritime security strategy that can help Australia defend its continent as well. And I think international law is important to this, and Australia's support for an UNCLOS-led maritime order is significant for understanding its approach to national security and to its region more generally. So as a middle-sized state, Australia has an interest in ensuring the legitimacy of international law that can help prevent great powers from unilaterally imposing their will in the maritime domain. So I would like to talk a little bit about Australia's Indo-Pacific concept, because Australia was an enthusiastic adopter of the Indo-Pacific regional nomenclature, adopting it well before the United States. And this concept essentially views the maritime domain as a central theatre of strategic competition. And this also, the adoption of the Indo-Pacific concept, which tries to bridge across these two maritime domains, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, reflects Australia's interest in protecting vital sea lines of communication. So the Indo-Pacific we can think of as being the strategic geography that underpins Australia's move from a middle power to a regional power conception of its role that sees Australia as increasingly wanting to assert an order-shaping role, including in terms of the rules. And within its Indo-Pacific discourses, there is a strong emphasis on law of the sea in Australia, in the way that Australia talks about the Indo-Pacific. So the three sort of central pillars of the Indo-Pacific concept include peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law, including UNCLOS. The second is freedom of navigation and overflight. And on issues of freedom of navigation, Australia does tend to cleave quite closely to the US interpretation of freedom of navigation. And the third is support for an existing rules-based order. Now, the use of the rules-based order in Australia's discourses intensified in 2016. And some of you might recognise this year as being the year where the South China Sea Arbitral Tribunal between the Philippines and China released its ruling. And this was a ruling that has been ignored by China. So the term rules-based order kind of intensified as a result of Australia's, or the leadership of Australia, their concerns about China's maritime coercion, around its lawfare strategies and its unwillingness to abide by the arbitral tribunal ruling. Now, the more recent 2020 Strategic Defence Update makes it clear that Canberra considers Australia's security outlook to have deteriorated considerably since the 2016 Defence White Paper, and this includes in the maritime domain. And while China is not always explicitly mentioned, there are references to grey zone tactics, military bases, and new weapons that challenge Australia's capability edge. And these references make it clear that Australia's security posture is driven by threat perception concerning China's rising military power and perceived and real revisionism in the maritime domain. So Australia's support for a maritime rules-based order can be seen through its 3 Ds of regional engagement: diplomacy, defence and development. For example, in July 2020, just before Australian officials met with US officials for their annual OSMIN meeting, the Australian mission to the United Nations clarified Canberra's legal position on South China Sea issues, explicitly rejecting China's maritime claims that are the claims that Australia views as inconsistent with UNCLOS, such as its historic rights argument within the 9-dash line. Now, operationally, Australia has focused on routinized security practices. So in the South China Sea, for example, Australian defence leaders have focused on what Australia has always done in supporting norms of freedom of navigation, including what is typically referred to in Australia as operational presence. Now, what that means is that Australia sends, naval ships through the South China Sea, but will only go within certain limits. Australia has thus far avoided conducting new activities that it sees as being likely to provoke Beijing, including US-style freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A as to why Australia has thus far avoided that. But in the last minute or so, I just wanted to say that Australia has its own compliance issues. One of the challenges, as Bryce mentioned, with like-mindedness across the Indo-Pacific is that even states that may share Australia or the US view on threats posed by rising China can actually have different interpretations of maritime rules. And I'm sure this is something that Rachel might be talking about a little bit later. But unlike the Quad partners of India and Japan, since the ratification of UNCLOS in 1994, Australia has not been subject to US-style FONOPs that challenge existing excessive maritime claims. But this does not necessarily mean that differences don't exist between Australia and the United States. Historically, Australia has tended to adopt a flexible pragmatism when it comes to international law of the sea, so has decided to ignore some sort of legal principles or viewpoints when it has suited its national interests. So in freedom of navigation, for example, at times Australia has sought to restrict freedom of navigation in its laws and security practices, including through introducing a compulsory pilotage law in the Torres Strait, declaring prohibited anchorage areas in its exclusive economic zone, and introducing mandatory ship reporting in parts of its exclusive economic zone. In terms of dispute resolution mechanisms under UNCLOS, which Australia supported during the negotiations of UNCLOS in the 1970s and 1980s, it itself has excluded Australia from compulsory jurisdiction of maritime boundary disputes. Now, what that means is, in practice, is that if one of its neighbours wants to take Australia to an arbitral court an arbitral tribunal or a court on maritime boundaries, that they would not be able to do so. Now, Australia enacted that exclusion in 2002, 3 months before Timor-Leste became independent, for the precise reason that it did not want Timor-Leste, the new state, to take it to any kind of international dispute resolution process, preferring instead to try and negotiate in bilateral terms, where, of course, Australia had significantly more resources and material power. So the third kind of area where there are some issues are in terms of excessive maritime claims. So Australian legislation designates Encounter Bay, Lasapede Bay, Rivoli Bay and Anxious Bay in South Australia as historic bays. These are not recognised by the United States. So Australia views these historic bays as internal waters and subject to Australian sovereignty, but the United States does not recognise this, and it has been called out in the US Maritime Claims Reference Manual. Australia also makes a bit of an ambiguous 2 million square kilometre EEZ claim and continental shelf claim off the coast of Australian Antarctic Territory. This is also not recognised by key Indo-Pacific partners, including all of the Quad states, the US, Japan and India. And happy to dig into this a little bit more in the Q&A for those who are interested. But I think one of the crucial parts of this panel is trying to decide whether or not, to the extent to which differences in international law matter for establishing maritime order. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Bryce.
Great, thanks, Beck. And a reminder, of course, that I think we'll just open it to anybody. If anybody has a question, of course, just put your hand up while the speakers are speaking. That's fine as well. We'll go to Lynn next.
Thanks so much, Bryce. I'm truly delighted to be here with you, my fellow panelists, as well as the Next Generation Policy Forum. Today, we're looking at aligning approaches to the international law of the sea in the Indo-Pacific. And I think in examining this question, it's useful to think about the different baskets of issues to the dispute and whether and the extent to which differing interpretations of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are relevant in each of these cases. Now, though it's often conflated, there are at least 4 baskets of issues or disputes in the South China Sea. The first are territorial disputes over land features. The second one, a resource dispute over maritime entitlements. The third, a quarrel over passage and other freedoms of the seas. And there is, of course, also the broader geostrategic competition between the United States and China. Now, on the territorial dispute over land features, I think that's in a sense the most clear-cut case. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea does not have provisions dealing with competing claims to land features. In other words, there is no issue of whether differing interpretations of UNCLOS have posed obstacles to settling maritime disputes or hampered coastal states' position vis-à-vis China. Now, that's the broad position, but there are, of course, always complications. And here's the complication. While UNCLOS does not deal with competing claims to land features, that is, features that are above water at high tide, UNCLOS does deal with whether or not a low tide feature or a submerged feature is capable of an independent sovereignty claim. So although UNCLOS doesn't directly deal with sovereignty issues, it indirectly deals with sovereignty issues by determining by having something to say over whether or not low tide elevations or submerged features are capable of an independent sovereignty claim. Now, features that are above water at high tide are capable of independent sovereignty claims. So the fact that it is within the EEZ of another state or of state A doesn't preclude it from actually belonging to state B. However, features that are below water at high tide will belong to the country in whose territorial sea it is located, or if it's within the EEZ of a particular country, then that low tide elevation or submerged feature falls within that country's sovereign rights and control. So it's not entirely clear what position claimant states in the South China Sea take on this particular issue, but I think most Southeast Asian claimant states have come to a general agreement that, low tide elevations are not capable of independent sovereignty claims. So last year, in a note verbal to the United Nations, Vietnam actually submitted a statement that stated that low tide elevations or submerged features are not capable of appropriation and do not in and of themselves generate entitlements to maritime zones. In contrast, of course, China has built on and fortified a low tide elevation within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, namely Mischief Reef. So there is general agreement within the claimant states, the Southeast Asian claimant states in the South China Sea, but of course their interpretation differs from China, who has actually taken actions that are problematic in the South China Sea, inconsistent with the reading of UNCLOS. Now, the second basket of disputes in the South China Sea are over maritime resources. And this part is really important because this is, together with territorial disputes, the crux of the contest between China and Southeast Asian claimant states. China claims wide swaths of the South China Sea, which impinges on the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. Beijing hasn't made clear on what basis it claims this overlap with the littoral states of Southeast Asia, with the waters of the littoral states of Southeast Asia. The first possible basis for its claims is its 9-dash line. China hasn't provided coordinates for its 9-dash line, but it clearly encompasses much of the South China Sea. In the Philippines case against China of 2016, which Beck already highlighted, the tribunal ruled that insofar as China was claiming historic rights to resources in the waters within the dash line, any such rights were extinguished by the entry into force of UNCLOS in 1994, given incompatibility with the system of maritime zones set out in the convention. So apart from very limited historic rights that might be recognized within territorial seas, within the 12 nautical mile zone of coastal states, if you're claiming historic rights to vast swaths of water, that's inconsistent with the system of maritime rights set out under UNCLOS. The second basis upon which China appears to be claiming economic rights in the South China Sea is an exclusive economic zone generated from features in the South China Sea that China claims, or groups of features. So increasingly, China appears to be saying, let's draw, a lasso around groups of features in the South China Sea, and from these features, there is going to be an EEZ that will overlap with the EEZ of other coastal states, and from which China, can claim economic rights. However, I think the tribunal made very clear that none of the features in the Spratlys, at least, including the largest features there, Itu Aba, are entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. At the very most, these features are only entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. It also added, in response to China's seeming claims that you can draw a lasso around groups of features and generate an EEZ from there. It also said that the Spratlys cannot be considered a unit from which maritime zones can be generated. Now, although the decision is only technically binding on parties to the dispute, so just binding on the Philippines and China, I think the logic or the decision generally confirmed that not only the Philippines, but also other Southeast Asian littoral states enjoy their EEZs unencumbered by China's 9-dash line or any claimed EEZ from features or groups of features in the Spratlys. Now, I think it was unclear previously the maritime claims that Southeast Asian littoral states were claiming, especially from features in the South China Sea as opposed to from their mainland. But I think there was in the past some evidence that suggested that they were moving towards a position consistent with UNCLOS, namely that they were not claiming EEZs from small features in the South China Sea. But since last year, I think any ambiguity over what they were seeking to claim from features in the South China Sea has been removed. I think in a series of diplomatic notes to the United Nations on the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, not just the Philippines, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which is a non-claimant state insofar as it doesn't have competing land territorial claims with China, but has overlapping maritime claims with China. These countries all have stated explicitly or implicitly that they accept the tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China as an authoritative ruling, and that, this, I think the net effect of these statements has been to clarify that Southeast Asian claimant states and Indonesia all have a clearly consistent stance on the issue of maritime resource entitlements in the South China Sea. So this, I think, is a very positive development and will certainly help to strengthen the position vis-a-vis China. That said, clearly aligning their position of maritime resource entitlements is just but one step in seeking to defend their rights to enjoy their respective EEZs unencumbered by China's 9-dash line or EEZ from features or groups of features. I think this, their ability to defend their economic resources against China's assertive claims will also depend on broader developments, such as the willingness and ability of the United States and other maritime powers to maintain a presence that will deter unchecked Chinese assertiveness. Now, this in turn, of course, brings me to the third basket of issues that I highlighted at the outset, namely that of passage and freedoms of the seas. Now, while we've seen a clearer convergence in the Southeast Asian states' position on the 9-dash line and resource entitlements from features in the South China Sea, sorry to say that not all Southeast Asian states share the same position on rights to passage and freedoms of the seas under UNCLOS. I don't think this directly weakens that position vis-a-vis China, since their main quarrel with China is over territorial and maritime resource claims. However, insofar as their position hurts passage rights and freedoms of the seas employed by the United States and other maritime powers who contribute towards maintaining a balance of power in the region, this indirectly undermines Southeast Asian states' position vis-a-vis China. And I think some Southeast Asian states do understand this. For instance, Vietnam, on its books, on its domestic legislation, it has a requirement that warships provide prior notification of their desire to exercise innocent passage within Vietnam's territorial sea. And of course, this is inconsistent with the reading of UNCLOS. But when the United States and other maritime powers seek to exercise innocent passage within the 12 nautical mile zone of features that Vietnam claims in the South China Sea, Vietnam has not protested, but has merely offered up that, freedom of navigation is very important. So I think Vietnam understands how passage and other freedoms of the seas, and having a consistent interpretation of this with maritime powers actually bolsters its position in the South China Sea and its ability to defend its economic rights. Unfortunately, countries like Malaysia have a position that, military activities in the exclusive economic zone are impermissible. And of course, this is inconsistent with a reading of UNCLOS, and it could hurt Malaysia's ability to defend its economic rights against China. So I think to briefly wrap up, I think, adopting a common position with Southeast Asian states on resource rights and with the United States and other maritime powers on passage and freedoms of the sea will allow for greater coordination and cooperation against unlawful claims and bolster the law of the sea. But this will, of course, require grit on the part of Southeast Asian states. China has taken umbrage at countries who have had the temerity to even reference the United Nations Tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China in the past. And maritime powers who have asserted passage and freedoms of the sea in the South China Sea have also faced China's ire. So the smaller Southeast Asian countries are likely to face even more reprisals. They will have to work with one another and also with the United States and other middle powers, not just in the South China Sea, but more broadly as well, such as in the economic realm, to provide a buffer for economic reprisals that they might face from China. And of course, a meaningful code of conduct which is consistent with international law should be a goal. But that said, it's unlikely that this will wholly resolve tensions in the South China Sea, which has become the hotbed of US-China rivalry, the fourth basket of issues I mentioned at the outset. So, but at the very least, bolstering the law of the sea will signal that China cannot bulldoze its interpretations through, and also provide guardrails against open conflict. And of course, this is a goal that we should all be working towards. Thank you.
Okay, great. Our next speaker is Rachel Asplin-Odell from the Quincy Institute. Rachel, take it away.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I really enjoyed hearing the remarks of Beck and Lynn before me, and look forward to our discussion. So, like Lynn, I think it's useful to divide the disputes over the law of the sea in Asia into a few different categories. And my remarks, I'm not going to focus on that first category she addressed necessarily of disputes over land and island and land features in this at sea, although of course those do sort of exponentially complicate maritime disputes. But I'll focus on maritime resources and disputes over maritime boundaries on one hand, and then disputes over military activities at sea in particular, or what some states would call freedom of navigation in the second category. So, it is important to note that if these matters are not perfectly divisible, because countries' claims to maritime boundaries can have significant implications for the physical extent of the authority that they claim over foreign military activities at sea. And this is especially the case with countries' claims from small islands or from groups of islands, such as those that Lynn described in the South China Sea. And thus, this can become a sort of complex tension between coastal states and maritime powers. However, I still think that this is a useful analytical distinction to begin with. So in the first category, I'd submit that most countries' claims are guided by, what Beck called a pragmatic desire to sort of maximize their interests, right, and to promote their claims to maritime resources and sovereignty and sovereign rights over the waters adjacent to their coasts to the maximum extent possible in light of their unique geographical circumstances. Aligning approaches on these issues thus often proves quite challenging, especially between states with overlapping boundary claims for obvious reasons. And these difficulties grow exponentially when there are disputes over land territory, whether borders on mainland territories adjacent to the ocean or disputes over small islands or large islands further offshore. And UNCLOS and customary international law does set out some important principles for states to follow in delimiting maritime boundaries, but there are nonetheless important areas of ambiguity that states are quick to exploit and reluctant to cede ground on, even when customary law is trending away from their preferred interpretation. So, we're talking here about what are the prospects for aligning interpretations. So I thought it might be useful to think through what are the different ways that states might try to align their approaches to the law of the sea. And I'm thinking about this in sort of broad terms, not just, the United States, Japan, Australia, or the Quad states, but just countries in general, because I think, that at least in principle, aligning approaches to the law of the sea will hopefully help reduce conflict. And I actually think China needs to be a key part of this as well in order to reduce those chances for conflict. Now, when you think of aligning perspectives, though, more generally, it's important to realize that one way that states can align perspectives is through either unilateral retrenchment or unilateral use of force, right? I mean, these are sort of the two extremes through which approaches can be aligned. Whether for good or ill, most of this is, I'm not really aware of any examples of this in the post-war, post-UNCLOS period in Asia, right? There have been very few examples of states sort of unilaterally rolling back their claims in the region. This has happened in some cases. The Philippines has reduced the extent of some of its claims in mostly over navigational issues in its waters, but countries have generally not just they don't like to back down from claims once they've made them. But at the same time, there have been relatively few examples of where the use of force has been so successful that they've convinced another state to completely drop a claim. Obviously, there's been examples of where countries have used force. China, a prominent one is China, consolidating control of the Paracel Islands and the waters around them from Vietnam, but Vietnam still claims them, so they still are not aligned. Now, in a more sort of peaceful vein, of course, countries can align through direct compromise. So there are examples of this in Asia. China and Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin agreed upon a maritime boundary in 2000, and it's sort of often unremarked upon, but that was a degree of progress before some sort of backsliding in the broader South China Sea maritime disputes. And then Australia and Timor-Leste, which Beck could tell you a lot more about, have been able to reach some direct compromise over maritime boundaries that are subject to potential change in the future, but nonetheless, that represents an aligning of positions that previously did not exist. Countries can also align through international arbitration. This can be an effective method, but it really only works when states agree to be bound by it and choose to use it as a method for resolving their disputes. This has happened more in Indian Ocean region than elsewhere in the Western Pacific. And in multilateral disputes, some claimant states can align with one another to gain leverage against another claimant state. So Lynn gave examples of how some of the ASEAN states have increasingly aligned their positions and their interpretations of the law of the sea in order to gain leverage against China in those disputes. At the same time, and there's a variety of ways they've done this, but then there are also ways in which some disputes persist among these countries, and that continues to present a challenge to both their leverage against China as well as just their individual national positions vis-a-vis one another. So given this sort of limited and fraught menu of options, it actually may be better for states not to align on these maritime disputes in some cases, and instead to either just ignore the dispute and sort of exercise unilateral restraint. This is easier when when the dispute doesn't have particularly high historical salience or national significance, or when there aren't a lot of resources in the area, or when states really get along really well and are able to sort of manage the issue without a lot of conflict. This has been more the case among some countries in in Oceania than in sort of the more in littoral Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. And then in addition, states can negotiate formal provisional arrangements of a practical nature. That's the frame from the framing and the wording from UNCLOS, where states are supposed to sort of actually negotiate joint development arrangements to exploit oil and gas or provisional fishery zones that really are without prejudice to the underlying sovereignty disputes or the underlying maritime boundary disputes. And there have been, a number of successful examples of those in the past. There were examples like this between Australia and Indonesia and then Timor-Leste preceding their more formal maritime boundary agreement, as well as in Northeast Asia between South Korea, Japan, China over fisheries managements. And some of these agreements are very successful. Others sort of over time meet with difficulties, as we've seen in the China-Japan agreements over oil and gas exploitation in the East China Sea. So, I think that it's worth noting that in general, countries only have a direct interest in those disputes that they're involved in. But of course, there are indirect interests, both in terms of the norms that might directly relate to their own disputes. For example, Australia and China both favor a natural prolongation principle for delimiting the boundary of the continental shelf between them and their opposing states. So China wants a natural prolongation principle to apply in the East China Sea vis-a-vis Japan so they can get as much as possible of that area. Australia has traditionally favored that principle vis-a-vis Timor-Leste, whereas Timor-Leste and Japan favor an equidistance or a median line principle. So it may be the case that Australia would have had an interest, or that China would have had an interest in Australia sort of getting more of its way in the Australia-Timor-Leste dispute and vice versa. But for the most part, countries tend to stay out of each other's disputes unless they also have implications for broader strategic and security reasons. And so that's sort of what I want to just conclude on that point before looking at the navigational principle issues, is that I think that with the United States and the South China Sea, my own view is that sometimes the United States has gone too far when it actually sort of reacts negatively to compromise between China and, say, the Philippines, because it's a complicated situation because sometimes that compromise between Xi Jinping and Duterte has gone contrary to the arbitration principle, the arbitration award in 2016, and so you can see why that would be objectionable to people who want to uphold those norms. But I think from the perspective of U.S. interests, is sort of peace and stability in the region and joint compromise that's actually practical and has traction in the region, I think that that's actually a positive thing. So I've basically used my time, so I won't go at length into the freedom of navigation issues now. But I guess the one point I want to make here is that the story here is far more complex than common rhetoric about freedom of navigation and a free and open Indo-Pacific would suggest. This rhetoric seems to imply that approaches toward the law of the sea break down along the lines of the US and its allies and partners versus China, but this is not in fact the case. Lynn already gave some great examples from Southeast Asia, but it actually goes beyond just Southeast Asia to encompass basically almost every single littoral state in the region that in some way or another disagrees with the United States in some aspect of military activities at sea or freedom of navigation. And in practice, of course, when you're aligned and your security interests are shared, it's usually not a source of conflict, except for sometimes when the US does freedom of navigation operations against those countries. But I think that where it becomes a challenge is when the United States, when really the core of its objection to what China is doing is actually freedom of navigation rather than these maritime issues, then the US priority in these disputes is quite different from those of its allies and partners in the region. And I think that really what the United States ought to do in approaching these issues is adopt a more compromise-oriented approach and recognize that sort of imposing an interpretation of freedom of navigation that very few countries in the region actually share on things like innocent passage in the territorial sea or in some cases military activities in the EZ actually sort of hurts its soft power and that it may not be conducive to stability. And the reaching agreements, compromise agreements about that might somewhat expand coastal states' jurisdiction over military activities at sea in terms of, requiring notification for exercises and things like that, could actually be stabilizing from a security perspective. and that these actually might be in the interests of countries like Japan and the Philippines, where China is increasingly operating in the waters near their coasts, or India, and is making them very nervous. And so that if the United States would work with its allies and partners, as well as China, to negotiate these compromise deals, these compromise rules that actually could be very conducive to stability, which would be in the interest of the United States and the region more generally. And there are some examples. There's been work done in that direction by groups of scholars from countries throughout the region, but it's lost traction in the last decade or so. And I think there's room for us to pick up on some of that work that's been done. And I hope that people in this group can be a part of that going forward.
Great. Let's move now to Hatakeyama Kyoko. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And thank you very much for inviting me to the forum. So I'm looking forward to your discussion. So today I will talk about the problems of the current regional situation and then suggest possible strategies for maintaining and strengthening the rules-based order. First, let me explain why the current maritime order is challenged by China despite UNCLOS. While UNCLOS provides a framework for appropriate state behavior, there is no authority for enforcing it. For instance, in 2016, the International Tribunal denied China's claim of historic rights to the South China Sea encircled by the 9-dash line. However, China ignored the ruling by saying that it was just a piece of paper. China has also justified its behavior, such as installing military bases on reclaimed land and strengthening its control over what it sees as its exclusive economic zone. China adheres to its claims despite the lack of legal grounds. As the continuation of Chinese activities shows, international law is powerless in enforcing compliance. Another difficulty is that UNCLOS is ambiguous, allowing for various interpretations by states. Differences in interpretation freedom of navigation between the United States and China are examples of this. Because of territorial disputes over inhabited shores and reefs, even the national boundaries of EEZ are not clear. UNCLOS is not a magic wand for resolving disputes. Nevertheless, thanks to US dominance, the region had enjoyed a relatively stable maritime order in the past. So in the past, territorial disputes arose among regional states over the reefs and the shores in the South China Sea. However, such disputes did not result in a major war or a significant change in the status quo. No states made excessive claims. In effect, the US presence as a hegemonic power in the region contributed to the preservation of the status quo. However, due to China's ascendance to economic and military superpower status, the power gap between the United States and China is narrowing. This shrinking disparity encouraged China to be assertive and adventurous. Yet, condoning China's unilateral claims will lead to the emergence of a power-based order. To maintain the rules-based order, what can be done? Three approaches to advancing the rules-based order can be effective. First, presenting strong narrative is essential. Second, providing assistance to ASEAN is crucial. Third, to ensure US military presence in order to check China's moves is indispensable. Let me explain why these approaches are essential. First, a compelling narrative is necessary to strengthen the rules-based order. Because there is no authority to enforce law, states need to articulate and present a strong narrative. Without doing so would lead to acquiescing in illegal claims and action. Any state can claim any right, even if it lacks grounds for doing so, and then change the status quo accordingly. In addition, and paradoxically, a challenging state can take advantage of law to justify its actions. For example, China justified its unilateral actions by using what it claims as its sovereign right to most of the South China Sea By using international law, a challenger justifies its actions and then accumulates many faits accomplished, thereby creating a new reality that serves its national interests. However, acquiescing in such actions will result in the emergence of a power-based order governed by arbitrary rules, not international law. Therefore, presenting a strong narrative that emphasizes the importance of law is essential. It may seem useless, but repeated argument will strengthen the normative structure that underpins the rules-based order. However, the problem of Asia is that regional states do not have a unified voice because of the rules-based order we are talking about is an ambiguous concept, lacking specificity. Most states agree to uphold a rules-based order, but the meaning of it is not clear-cut. Various concepts proposed by the regional states show that the countries agree in principle, but not in detail. For instance, Japan proposed the free and open Indo-Pacific concept and emphasized the rule of law along with economic prosperity. The United States had supported this concept. For its part, ASEAN announced an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The concept emphasized rules-based framework, inclusivity, respect for international laws such as UNCLOS. However, while ASEAN supported rules and laws as the guiding principle, it also underlined the inclusion of China. Finally, India announced the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, emphasizing the inclusiveness of the concept and its strategic autonomy. India's vision implies its desire to maintain autonomy without becoming directly involved in a power competition between the United States and China. These various concepts show that no identical views regarding the rules-based order exist in Asia, even though the regional states have serious concerns about China's assertiveness. Unfortunately, this lack of consensus over the meaning of the rules-based order weakens the argument and fails to urge China to respect international law. Therefore, we need to keep arguing and then have more dialogue among the regional states to promote a common understanding of the meaning of the rules-based order. Second, maintaining US presence in the region is vital to stop China from escalating its behavior. As I said, the power gap between the United States and China is shrinking. This reduced gap encouraged China to take assertive steps in the maritime domain. If the US presence declines in the future, the power vacuum will facilitate China further expanding its influence and military presence in the region. Given the declining US and Japanese economic presence in the region, the alliances and coordination with like-minded states should be strengthened. Considering that ASEAN is not necessarily supportive of US policy in Asia, maintaining its presence through the alliances will reduce ASEAN's concern. Third, wealthier states such as the US, Australia, and Japan need to assist ASEAN. Japan, the United States, and Australia have enough resources to provide ASEAN with economic assistance and capacity building support to strengthen their law enforcement capacity in the maritime domain. Capacity building support may seem trivial because, unlike infrastructure development projects, it is not evident. However, such support, which involves joint training and installation of standardized procedures, accompanies communications and interactions with underlying messages and norms. That means this support can effectively deliver a message and nurture common understanding among the participant states. I emphasize the importance of this type of assistance because ASEAN is taking a balancing behavior showing consideration toward China. While ASEAN stresses the importance of the rules-based order in the ASEAN outlook, China's economic assistance looks attractive for ASEAN that hopes to promote economic growth. Even though they understand China's assistance may be a double-edged sword, China is still an attractive partner. For instance, China provided vaccines to the ASEAN states promptly. The amount of provision exceeded that of COVAX, an international framework to ensure global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. China's doses to ASEAN amounted to 120 million, which is 4.8 times as many as those provided by COVAX. In Cambodia and Indonesia, 96% of the vaccines inoculated are Chinese vaccines, with Laos accounting for 89% and the Philippines accounting for more than 60%. This Chinese assistance would not directly affect the argument among the regional states over the rules-based order. However, massive assistance is likely to affect and influence ASEAN's attitude. In conclusion, I propose to present the argument, maintain US presence, and provide assistance to such as capacity building support to ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Same rules apply now. I'd like to get the speakers on this panel and the other panel talking to one another if possible, but anybody can jump in at this stage. I've got a question, and some of you have touched on it, more or less all of you have touched on it actually. It's the question that's in the program, and that's whether this actually matters from a political point of view. Right, we do have countries claiming themselves to be sort of bastions of the rules-based international order and then taking positions that may or may not be completely aligned with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We do have countries with different interpretations. Now, the assumption, I guess, in the panel description is that this is a political problem, particularly among those countries who want to deal with the challenge of a rising China. I guess my question is simply, is it? Is it reasonable to expect that a modus operandi where people, disagree with each other's claims won't necessarily weaken, it's a political question, I guess, won't necessarily weaken a common front against China? And I see that Rachel's got her hand up, so we'll go to her first.
Yes, it's a great question. I think, I was getting at this at the end of my remarks, but I think it's potentially a problem, especially for middle powers and weaker powers in Asia. I think the lack of alignment on freedom of navigation issues, and in particular their default deference to the U.S. position, even though they actually disagree in many cases with the U.S. position, but they're sort of aligned with the United States, roughly speaking, even if not formally, in security terms. That's led to this longstanding deference. I think it's increasingly creating a problem for them as China is now becoming a major maritime power. And you see this most notably in the case of Japan, where Japan really likes to portray itself as a state that favors freedom of navigation, but it has a very different interpretation of transit passage through straits than the United States does. It argues that transit passage, which is a more liberal regime than innocent passage, really should only apply in 5 straits. Well, actually, it doesn't even apply there, but because they've limited the breadth of their territorial sea. So they argue that it doesn't apply anywhere else in their straits. Over time, China has aligned itself with the US position and used that as leverage against Japan to operate more freely within Japanese straits. And they could take this much further than they have already to include flying aircraft over more Japanese straits, which China has not yet done. So I think that, and then you could make similar arguments for foreign military activities that in the EEZ, where China is making Japan nervous in various ways. And so Japan, actually has interests that diverge from those of the United States to some extent when it comes to wanting to expand its its jurisdiction over foreign military activities in these waters. And yet it really sort of, it rhetorically uses this language of freedom of navigation. So I think that this is, and it's also the same challenge applies to the Philippines and to India, as well as other countries in the region. So I actually think that, if these countries, were thinking in sort of longer term prospects, they would actually be trying to at least quietly pressure the United States to agree to broader regional rules that wouldn't give them a little more leverage against China in normative terms, just so that they can, require more notification from China, so that they can have, somewhat more visibility and stability and feel less vulnerable to China's growing naval power. And, it would take a lot for the United States to sort of change its traditional way of thinking about freedom of navigation in these ways. But like I mentioned, there's been a number of think tanks and experts that have developed some initial rules on what this could look like regarding foreign military activities in the EZ, that included scholars from the US, Japan, China, India, Australia, basically all of these countries in the region. And I think that, if we pick those back up, those could really form the basis of a better compromise regime that I also, speaking as American, I don't think it would harm US interests either. I don't think we need the maximal freedom of navigation that we usually insist upon.
Great. Okay, Beck, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to just contribute to this discussion, because it's actually something I've been thinking a lot about, this question of, I guess, normative flexibility, whether we need to have exactly the same interpretation of international law, or whether there's a degree to which states that the order can be maintained at the same time as states may carry different interpretations of international law without completely undermining the maritime order. I think it's a really important question, and I think that there's probably still work to be done in kind of international relations theory, as well as the scholarship on that issue. I would also, I think I agree with what Rachel said in her presentation, that there's areas in which difference really does matter and has security implications, or could have future security implications, but there may be areas where difference in interpretation matters less. And so it partly, I think the project is about identifying when it really matters, and freedom of navigation is one area, but the other one is in terms of maritime disputes. In terms of resolving maritime disputes, it's important that states do get on the same page. And we Rachel talked a little bit about the Timor Sea dispute, and that did require Australia to compromise on the issue of natural prolongation, which Australia believed or has long argued, for 50 years has argued, that natural prolongation is the principle that should be used in deciding the continental shelf in the Timor Sea. And Australia ultimately had to change its position on that issue. But that may have ramifications in terms of its maritime boundaries with Indonesia, which the continental shelf boundaries were formed in 1972 based on natural prolongation. And now, because Australia compromised in the 2018 Timor Sea maritime boundary with Timor-Leste on the issue of natural prolongation, there's a sense in which Indonesia may now be saying we need to reassess those boundaries because Australia relented on the issue of natural prolongation. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it is political difference in interpretation, but it does have implications for how states will resolve disputes. The other one that I wanted to mention was the Chagos issue, where there seems to be a difference in interpretation of the rules-based order. The United Kingdom has, there's been a variety of legal opinions, advisory opinions that have been offered about the legitimacy of the United Kingdom's sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. And there's pressure on the UK internationally to change its stance. And while the UK declares itself as being a supporter of the rules-based order, it has ignored some of this, or at least at the moment ignores some of this pressure. And that has, I think, real strategic implications because, of course, there's a US military base on Chagos. So it's not just that these are political problems, but that difference in interpretation and exceptionalism, so that the willingness of states to ignore international law when it suits their interests has real, I think, security implications.
Okay, Chikako, I know you've got your hand up, but I think Lynn wants to probably respond directly to this conversation. Yeah, so we'll go to Lynn first.
Thanks so much, Bryce. I think we need to distinguish between differences between states that are viable under UNCLOS and those that have no basis whatsoever under UNCLOS. And this isn't just a matter of interpretation. So, for instance, Rachel mentioned earlier some of the maritime boundary disputes between states in the region. And I think that's perfectly legitimate to have, overlapping territorial seas, in most cases, exclusive economic zones, because under UNCLOS, you're allowed, each state is allowed 200 nautical miles EEZ and continental shelf. In some cases, they're allowed even beyond that for continental shelves. And in some cases where the width of the waterway is smaller than, say, 400 nautical miles, you're going to have EEZs that legitimately overlap. And under UNCLOS, there is provision, there is a solution provided to that. States should negotiate. When negotiations don't work, they should go to dispute resolution. So these are where there are differences that are viable under UNCLOS and therefore viable under international law. However, there are certain circumstances which are more worrying, and I would put cases where, say, for instance, China claims territorial rights over low tide elevations or submerged features in another state's EEZ. There's no basis for that under UNCLOS. There is also no basis under UNCLOS for claiming historic rights to wide swaths of water. So it's 9-line insofar as it's a claim to economic resources. There's no basis for that, and I think that's problematic. I also think, and in this I would probably disagree a bit on with some of the other speakers. I also think that in terms of, say, requiring prior authorization before a state may exercise innocent passage through another state's coastal state, there is absolutely nothing in UNCLOS that requires that. And to mandate that kind of leads to us moving away from what UNCLOS requires. And while one might think, oh, that's a small thing, prior authorization, what's the problem with that? But, if a state withholds prior authorization, that's, or the ability to exercise innocent passage in certain circumstances, I think that could have huge repercussions. And where does one stop? It becomes a slippery slope where you start taking away right over right because you're trying to compromise. And I think that becomes problematic. So I think there's that situation. So I do think in some cases differences are viable, in some cases they're not. And of course, even if there were no differences so it's important that, that states who are worried about the erosion of the rules-based order have a consistent interpretation of UNCLOS. That will help in promoting the rules-based order. On the other hand, just because we have a consistent interpretation of UNCLOS, I don't think that solves all problems. As I said earlier, we have huge geopolitical competition between the United States and China, and that's going to continue even if we resolved all the issues of passage and freedoms of the seas between China and the United States. They found ways to disagree on a lot of things because every issue now has, in a sense, become a means by which they gain competitive advantage over the other side. So even if we had no disagreement on passage and freedoms of the seas, we would still continue to have geopolitical tensions and tensions in the South China Sea or in the waterways of the Indo-Pacific. So I think I'll stop there, but that's kind of my response to the question.
Good. Okay, thanks, Lynn. Now we'll move to Chikako, who's been waiting patiently with her hand up. So to the rest of you, of course, anybody can chime in now. So please do put your hands up if you have a question.
Thank you so much, Bryce. Lynn's already touched upon some of the questions I was going to ask, but what I wanted to do was push the participants, the panelists, a bit more further in coming up with a sort of the common denominator of the rules that countries can realistically agree upon, and also to talk about what is on the other side of the line that is absolutely permissible, that is a rule-breaking activity. I think Lynn touched on some of them, but I want to ask the other panelists as well. And the second question I have is, I think that many countries in the region rely upon US command of the commons, so to speak, its ability to be able to intervene in regional disputes at a relatively low cost, because it has the control. And I think that would mean that the US having relatively, freedom of action in the high seas and their space above that. So my question is, would the legal, not looking at the capabilities, but the legal aspect, the rules aspect, does the fact of how we interpret what is allowed in the high seas, and especially in the EEZ in this case, have an implication to the US ability to intervene in regional conflicts? And also, does it have an implication to the credibility of the US alliance and the US ability to maintain stability in the region? Thank you.
I'll try to just chime in briefly. I agree with Lynn and Chikako that there does have, it's not like anything goes into compromise. And I think that it's important that, the United States and other countries support some of the basic clear rules of international law. I think that's why, some of the examples that Lynn discussed in her presentation and referred to just now of China's excessive claims in the South China Sea to historic rights, which, are still ill-defined. Are they making an exclusive claim? What are the exact bounds of that claim? But nonetheless, certainly their behavior suggests that their interpretation and application of that claim goes beyond the bounds of customary international law, not to mention UNCLOS. So those are the kinds of things that countries should try to align, contra that kind of excessive claim. And when it comes to claims from islands, I think it becomes a little more complex, in part because, of course, the arbitration in some ways made it simple, and Lynn described that. But it actually also made it a lot harder in other ways because China didn't accept it. The reality is China will never accept it. So what do we do now? The arbitration arguably made it a lot harder for any compromise to be achieved by sort of declaring that none of the islands are subject or are eligible for any EZ. And, there's a legitimate legal argument to be made for that position, but from a political perspective, I think it's probably made the situation much harder. And so, just in light of the reality of China's position and its growing power in the region. So I think that this is, it's a challenge, where of course, some areas you have to push back, some areas you have to be willing to seek compromise. And I think that, over reliance on a rules-based order narrative can lead to an overly zero-sum attitude towards this. It sort of suggests that at every point, China has to be opposed or treated as an adversary, when actually in some cases, China's interpretations of the law of the sea are increasingly aligned with those of the US. And I actually think it's in the interest of countries in the region more generally to, reach compromise agreements on those matters that protect their interests against, great power collusion, and not just great power competition. So I think it has to be kind of a mixed story.
Okay, great. Kyoko, do you want to chime in on this?
Yes. Thank you for the very interesting question. So I just want to make a response to the question raised by Ueki Sensei. Regarding the question one, what is permissible? I think, yes, there are many interpretations in the world, and it is quite difficult for us to have an identical view. And also there is an exceptionalism, like Beck said. For example, Jago's case is a good example. However, what is not okay is change the status quo by force. And, you could claim anything, and because there are many interpretations in the world. But what is not acceptable is to change the status quo by force. That is what China is doing at the moment. So that is the reason that the world started to pay attention to the, Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea issues. And also even Europe started to send warships to Asia because, these states think it is not okay to change the status quo by force. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait, that means the change of the status quo by force. That was not acceptable. And China has not invaded anything, but what China is doing is changing the status quo by force. So it is a small step, but that could lead to a bigger step. So that is the reason we are worried so much. And regarding the question number 2, the predictability of the US alliance, regarding this point, Japan got US assurance regarding the Senkaku Islands because the United States assured again and again that the United States would invoke Article 5 of the alliance. So Japan got US pledge that US would defend Senkaku Island in case of contingency. So regarding from Japan's point of view, the United States is a reliable partner. However, for other states like the Philippines, maybe it is not clear. So if the United States want to strengthen tie with the Philippines or other Asian countries, maybe the United States need to clarify what it is going to do in case of the contingency. So in this point, the US is a very reliable partner for Japan, but I'm not sure for ASEAN states. Thank you.
Okay, Lynn, you have your hand up. I take it you want to respond to this?
Thank you. In terms of what's permissible, I think I completely agree with Rachel's point that, not everything that China does is necessarily problematic. So for instance, the fact that China and the Philippines entered into a memorandum of understanding to cooperate on oil and gas development, I think, some of the more hawkish views were that this is terrible. How could the Philippines do that? It's giving up its sovereign rights and resources to its own EEZ. But actually, it depends on how the agreement is framed. So for instance, if the agreement were framed so that China and the Philippines are equally entitled to the resources off the Philippines coast, that's a bit problematic because as the tribunal found, China has no overlapping claims with the Philippines in that respect, right? The Philippines enjoys its EEZ unencumbered from the 9-dash line, by the 9-dash line, or any EEZ generated from features in the Spratlys. So, but if the agreement, however, were framed such that the Philippines has complete sovereign rights and control over those waters, but it hires or it contracts with China as a subcontractor to help the Philippines, which does not have the requisite technology in this respect, drill for oil and gas in this area, and it pays China to do that. That's a more acceptable proposition. So in some cases, we don't have to be jumping at everything China does, but we have to ensure that what it does is permissible under international law, it's allowed under international law. And then in terms of what's not permissible, and this is tied up to what Chikako asked about, how does what is permissible and not permissible impact the ability of the United States and other powers to intervene in the occasion of a conflict? Now, I would say that the ability to conduct military exercises in the EEZ of coastal states is an absolute non-negotiable factor. So we look into history, it used to be just the territorial seas and the high seas. And then with UNCLOS, we had the exclusive economic zone kind of carved out from the high seas, which allowed coastal states exclusive economic rights to the waters within that 200 nautical mile EEZ. This didn't change any of the other high sea security freedoms, etc., but only gave the coastal states economic rights. So I think the fact that we might try to negotiate, security rights as well for coastal states within the EEZ that don't impinge on their economic rights. I think that's non-negotiable because it impacts on the ability of naval powers and allies and partners to be able to intervene in the event of a conflict. So I think that would be highly problematic. And we see why this would be problematic if we look at the code of conduct that China is currently negotiating with ASEAN member states. And in that code of conduct, China is seeking to say that in the event that there are a coastal state wants to conduct military activities with other outside powers, the permission of other states, including China, should be first sought, and that starts to provide a no-go zone in the region, which will be highly problematic in the event of conflict. And gradually, what that means is that you have an increasing power sphere where not only in cases of actual conflict, but there's an increasing dominance of China and the inability of other powers to hold sway in the region, which would have a mitigating effect in terms of the balance of power. So I think we want to avoid things like that. It's just a slippery slope that I worry about.
Okay, next, great answers, by the way. Next, we're going to go to Carmina, who's back. Carmina, do you want to? Are you directing your question at anybody first, or?
No, actually, it's for anybody who wants to answer. Maybe for Ms. Lin, probably, because now I'm going to raise the issue of a known unknown, which is, well, the South China Sea issue, especially with the case of the South China Sea arbitration, I think it's not just really about EEZ and resource conflict in the economic sense, but some scholars actually consider the South China Sea arbitration as a landmark case for requiring an interpretation of the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And one of the the reason why they gave it to the Philippines is because Chinese activities cause severe harm in the maritime ecosystem. So it's not just about resource conflict in the way who benefits from this territorial dispute, but one of the main things that the Philippines raise is how do we protect turtles, for example. Even Washington Post had a headline of turtles being a flashpoint of Philippine-China relations. And here we're talking about arriving at a common understanding. So my question is, to what extent is the environment, climate change issues like this in relation to territorial dispute a point where we can reach a common understanding? Because now China is moving towards energy, green energy, and so on and so forth, and that's their source of pride. But when it comes to territorial disputes, we know China is not just building military fixtures or structures in Spratlys. By doing so, they're also destroying coral reefs. So I think this is an issue that needs to be discussed. To what extent, again, is this UNCLOS, this territorial dispute could lead us to thinking maybe beyond sovereignty and national interest, but more of a environment concern, angle. Thank you.
Who wants that? Beck, I saw you nodding vigorously. Oh, well, Lynn's just unmuted herself. Oh, Beck?
Very briefly before Lynn. So one of our colleagues at the University of New South Wales, Pichumon Yeofontong, talks a lot about the environmental issues in the South China Sea dispute. And I think it's really fair that you've picked up on that issue. I only wanted to say, and she does work on sort of environmental peace building as a concept that she applies to the South China Sea as well as to other areas such as the Mekong area. But I wanted to just add in and say that the environmental aspects of the South China Sea are increasingly a basis for cooperation among states. This is seen as it's a term that's used a lot, kind of low-hanging fruit for states, Southeast Asian states, to engage with other states such as Australia in maritime cooperation in a way that doesn't necessarily provoke great power consternation. So things like coral reef degradation, you have experts working together from different countries on that. You have marine science diplomacy on issues such as pollution in the maritime commons. There's a range of other issues that I'm not as familiar with, but that is actually, I think, a basis for bilateral and multilateral cooperation.
Fantastic. And the great news is that Pichamon is going to be part of this forum in one of the later panels.
Oh, good. I'm glad to.
Yeah. So we do have a question from Yosuke Sawayama, I think it is. The last bit of your last name has dropped off, but I will be sending around a program soon. But it is Phoebe is now typing it out. So let's hope she gets the spelling right. Phantong. There we go. So Dr. Pichamon Yofantong is her name. Great. Did anybody else want to take a bite of that question? Yeah, Lynn? This better be the last intervention, I think. Yep.
Yeah, I think as Beck pointed out, there's certainly scope for the environment providing a means by which countries can work together and reach a common understanding. But I'm not entirely optimistic about how far we can go with that. If we look at other issues where you would expect cooperation to because it matters so greatly to both sides, the United States and China, say COVID-19 cooperation would have made perfect sense then, right? Dealing with it and its economic fallout. And yet we saw so little cooperation in that respect. I think the fact of the matter is that geopolitical competition and great power rivalry has subsumed so many of the other issues which could potentially be used to work together to foster a greater understanding. And we see those issues used as a sword rather than as a hand held out in friendship. So I think, there is some scope for that, but I wouldn't take it. I am not all that optimistic. And if we look at the reason why the environmental issue was raised, it was raised in the South China Sea Tribunal ruling because there were certain Chinese activities that were considered objectionable, and so for instance, reclaiming land on these features in the South China Sea, as well as militarizing them. But the tribunal wasn't able to directly rule on whether or not that was unlawful or not, because this would depend, of course, on whether or not China had sovereignty over these features. And the tribunal didn't have jurisdiction to hear on issues of sovereignty over land features, because UNCLOS doesn't deal with those issues. So all the tribunal was able to say was that China's island building and militarization of features on Mischief Reef, which, as you remember, is a low tide elevation within the Philippines EEZ, that was objectionable because the Philippines has jurisdiction and control over that. But for the other features on which China reclaimed land as well as militarized, what the tribunal was able to find was that, this damaged the environment and hence it was problematic. So in a sense, the environment was brought up later as well, especially by the United States, as an issue to say, China, bad China, you are doing all of this and you should stop. So even then, there was a geopolitical element to the environment.
Okay, we'll wrap this panel now. Thank you all. That's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to Beck, Lynn, Rachel, and Kyogo.